Well, Andrew, I'm welcoming you, though I think you should welcome me. It's your software. So thank you for coming to our rescue when the software I had in mind didn't do as it would promised on the tin. Anyway, it's wonderful to meet you. And some people are going to need an introduction to you. But at the simplest level, you're a businessman, an entrepreneur who is naturally Jewish but became a Catholic. So before we get on to the business world stuff, can we talk about the soul? How did this particular Jew become a believing Catholic?
Wow. There's the short answer and the long answer. And Gavin, thank you so much for having me on your podcast. And anyone who's listening, thank you for spending the time with us today. The short answer is truth, goodness, and beauty, I would say. That's the Cliff Notes answer. The longer version is I came to the faith in my late 40s, a long circuitous route, grew up Jewish, and then left the church. I think the synagogue, I guess you call it. I would say that I saw videos of the Holocaust in Hebrew school, and I became pretty clear that there could be no God when I was a young child. Stop.
This is so important. Just, if you don't mind, can we do it like this? Can I interrupt you? And then
sure, please.
We'll pick up from that, because I saw pictures of the Holocaust when I was a child, and I said immediately, there must be a God, because I looked at this, and there was absolutely nothing in my juvenile anthropology that allowed me to conceive of what I saw in the photographs as being the product of natural humanity. I mean, once a child, when I was an early teenager, I guess, and I thought, even though I've never had a very high view of human beings, my view was never so low that I could imagine they could do this to each other on their own accord. And so I said to myself, I think I'm looking at evil, not depraved human beings, not a bad regime, not the outcome of fascists who are racists. I'm looking at something that's got into human beings to make them behave in this appalling way. If there's evil, there must be a God. And at that moment, I became a sort of theoretical deist, but it had exactly the opposite effect. And so I'm not saying I'm right and you're wrong. I'm just obviously I'm not saying that. I'm just very interested in the fact you can have two boys looking at these dreadful pictures. And I suppose, I mean, it turns out I'm patrilineally Jewish, so we have more genetic material in common than you might think to look at us. But I'm wondering if it's got something to do with the fact that, not knowing I was Jewish, there was a level of, I didn't get how personal this was. Whereas you knew you were Jewish, and you knew this was done to your people, and the whole purpose of God within the Jewish covenant is to protect, purify, and lead them. And he'd failed on the protection. So was that the point with which you said?
I think, this is all in retrospect, sort of putting this together, so I don't know at the time. I think probably there is a big aspect of me just wanting to be freed from the shackles of the moral law also.
Oh, yes, okay, so that's able normal. Yeah, sure.
That was an easy way to check out of having to do anything that I didn't want to do. So it was like the early rebellion of a 12-year-old or 13-year-old boy who wants to do what he wants and doesn't want parents or gods or anybody in the way of the sovereign will, which I was aware of even at that time. And so being a rambunctious boy, I got into a lot of trouble, and then became a musician and was traveling around playing music. I left the United States and started traveling around the world. I left and traveled for 13 years playing music, doing various and sundry other things.
What kind of music? What sort of musician were you?
I write songs as well as play cover music, and I would say mostly the cover music I played abroad was what you could generally call Americana music. So trying to bring music that might not travel across the seas in the same way that the highest level hits do. So bringing bluegrass music, blues music, music that's typical of the United States, that's pretty provincial for here, to other people around the world. And so that was kind of what I was doing. And then so it was sort of that music life led me into areas of darkness. I guess Aquinas would call it, the four substitutes for God: power, pleasure, wealth, and honor. I really focused on the pleasure part first. The musical life lent itself to that, wine, women, and song. And I took advantage of that because it seemed like, although I didn't start playing music for those reasons, they seemed to be nice accoutrements.
Useful byproduct.
Yeah, it seemed like a pretty valuable byproduct. Looking back, Aquinas had a point. It wasn't a great solution, but it did for a young boy, and then let's say an aging adolescent way beyond his years. Also seemed like a good way to be. But as you know, and anybody who's probably listening to this and has come to the faith understands that that's a road of darkness. I did realize that, and I started to seek. Obviously, also the artistic pursuit was seeking in a certain way too. I mean, you're looking for, truth, goodness, and beauty, and the artistic pursuit at its core was looking for beauty, looking for that transcendence. Which is, let's say, I forget who said it, but it's like the eternal breaking through into the temporal, in a way. Beauty is when you capture something musically, a musical idea that's really, truly beautiful. So I got into what I would say would be
Plato said it first, I think.
Oh, really? That could, yeah. I was listening to someone was quoting it yesterday. I forget who it was. But and then that led into a long dalliance in what I would call the New Age. So I got into Eastern spirituality, so Buddhism, Hinduism, be here now kind of stuff, I guess, for a long time, and that was quite helpful actually, because it was the first time I was able to get in touch with the Holy Spirit. I didn't know it as the Holy Spirit at that time, but I did feel a sort of love and a sort of peace through those practices that was beneficial. Though towards the end, I still was able to go down quite a few dark roads with that, because essentially I was creating like a postmodern pastiche of a spiritual life. A little bit of Buddhism. It's like a buffet. Little Hinduism here, but when Hinduism said something I didn't like, I went into Buddhism. And when it wanted to constrain me in ways that I didn't want to be constrained, I went into whatever else. So I was basically still the center of my life. It was still my sovereign will, essentially, running the show. And given that I'm a fallen person prone to all sorts of sin and depravity and darkness, that's not a good thing for me to be in charge. Ultimately, I came across the teachings of this gentleman by the name of Dr. Jordan Peterson. He did this lecture series called The Psychological Significance of the Biblical Stories. And it was the first time since probably Hebrew school that I had been, somebody talked to me about the Bible. And I just I dismissed the Bible completely as a silly old book that didn't have much to do with my life. I was much more interested in the Tao Te Ching or the, Bhagavad Gita or, Thich Nhat Hanh or these people. And then when Dr. Peterson was coming at the Bible, he was coming at it in a roundabout way. He was coming at it in a psychological way, telling stories that, looking at the stories themselves and why they'd lasted for so long. Things like, looking at the flood and saying, well, we're all kind of in a flood, right? And the flood is always coming. Suffering's coming. We're in a temporal world. So we should probably be building our ark, right? We should be building our relationships and we should be building ourselves up in this way. Like things like this. And I thought it was really powerful, and it really changed my life because he talked a lot about the importance of telling the truth. And I didn't see the truth as a really important thing. I sort of saw it as like instrumental. If I needed it, it was useful sometimes, and other times less useful, so to be discarded as per need. And so Dr. Peterson started to discuss the importance of God speaking forth the world, and the truth being that if you're not living through spoken word, that is your spoken word is not true, you're sort of bringing hell on earth. You're living the absolute opposite of faith. Because you're creating what you think the world should be. You're manipulating the world in a certain way. The life of faith would be to tell the truth and trust that God is going to provide for you whatever sort of come what may. And I found this really profound. I was, it really changed my perspective. And I started to clean up my life because of that. I thought it was really important. And then one day, he brought on this gentleman, Bishop Robert Barron, on his podcast. And I would never have gone to a priest in any way. Like, I thought that was silly, Christianity as an actual concept to me seemed kind of strange. People don't raise from the dead. That seems obvious and silly. And I would never go to somebody and talk to anybody with a Roman collar, because what are they going to tell me except that, it's bad to do all the things that I'm doing. So why do I want to hear that message? And who are they to talk, right? I mean, look at the scandals and look at the Inquisition, sort of the history of my people in the church. So I didn't really have much use for priests. And then Bishop Barron came on and sort of introduced me to the arguments of St. Thomas Aquinas, which I had never heard before. The arguments for God's existence. It goes back to Aristotle, the arguments from first causes and the principle of change. So if we have, contingent changes, you really can't have that going back to that either logically it goes back to a eternal regression, or there is a first principle, there is a first cause. And that just seemed more reasonable to me. And then I started listening to more of Bishop Barron. At the same time, I was doing these meditations, these Buddhist meditations, and I was doing them in the quietest and most beautiful places I could find in Europe, which was where I was living in Vienna. And those happened to be churches. So I was playing music on the street. I was making my living at the time. I was part of what they call the U-Bahn program. So they have musicians that play on the street, and I was one of them in the U-Bahn. And so in between my sets, I would go and sit in these beautiful churches and meditate. And I would do that for hours upon hours, and it just so happened that they call it in Latin the via pulchritudinis, the way of beauty. Little by little, as I was sort of taking in the kind of truths of the faith, the truth of the faith through Bishop Barron, I was also taking in the beauty. And whilst I may have had more problems with the truth, it sort of lagged a little bit, because there were still problems I had with assumptions and Marian problems and just various. I could get to God, but it was harder for me to get to Jesus and to Mary. That was more difficult. It was a little slower going for me. But sitting in a St. Charles Cathedral on a weekend in Vienna and listening to Bach's Mass in B minor was sort of undeniable. I mean, the beauty of it was undeniable. And little by little, as I sat beneath the cross every day for hours doing these meditations, and then on the weekends listening to this music, the most beautiful music, so I'm a huge fan of Bach. He's, to me, the highest music I've ever heard in my life. There's the Bach-ological argument for God's existence. The music of Bach exists, ... Therefore God exists.
Therefore God, yes.
Right. The Bach-ological arguments for the existence of God.
Very good.
And then that beauty just seeped into my soul, and it sort of became clear to me, because I would walk around and I would go to these other buildings, like say newer buildings, and I would look around and I'd say, these new buildings, they're so pragmatic and ugly. They're all this windows and all of this kind of cubicles and weird shapes. And then I would go back to these old medieval churches and I'd say, maybe we forgot. I think the people that we've forgotten more about what the human heart needs than we've gained. Okay, we create nice little devices and we have these beeping and bopping little handheld devices, and we created air conditioning. We created some good things, but we've also forgotten quite a bit, I think. The importance of beauty, the importance of transcendence. We live in a sort of immanentist world. Everything is just matter in motion. And that led to a massive darkness in my own soul. Because if you had pushed me, Gavin, I would have said that life is a series of experiences, some of which I like, some of which I don't like. And so my strategy, my philosophy, as it were, was to maximize the experiences I liked and do my best to minimize the experiences I didn't like, which led me into all forms of addiction, essentially, at the end of the day. So it's a stupid strategy. And so what I'm really saying is I had no meaning in my life. There was no meaning. And then when I came to the church, it was as though this woman I heard one time say this way, and I thought this is a pretty good summation. She said, I had found some of the pieces of the puzzle of my life over the years, but when I found the Catholic Church, I found the puzzle box. I found the overall sense of how everything fits together. And that was the case for me. it was the answer that I was looking for. I was a nomad. I was traveling around playing music, trying to start various crazy projects and all sorts of weird life. But as Augustine said, I was the, people like that are the most, their hearts are the most restless. I had a profoundly restless heart. I could settle nowhere. And then, when I found the Lord and I found his church, I could finally find rest in the world. And I could finally find the purpose of my life. And it became clear to me, all of it sort of, I came to realize that the church is right about everything. And I sort of was like, where were you my whole life? Where have you been? Because I was asking all of these questions, and you're right about the nature of reality. You're right about the anthropology of the human person, about human sexuality, which I was profoundly wrong about. Right about morality itself, because you start from the right first principles. Whereas the modern world is totally insane, and I was a child of that modern world. So my philosophy was all messed up, my metaphysics was messed up, my theology was messed up, and so my life was disordered and crazy. And the Lord, thank God, came down to save just a sinner like me and everybody listening, in order to save me. And it comes from the same root as heal, right? Salvation, that healing. And it's amazing, and it's so I also understand as a sort of rejoinder at the last note. I understand now how Christianity spread all over the world. People were like, there's all these theories of like, colonialization, and the church wanted to whatever, all that, this insanity of all critique, which is the modern world. I would say it's all critique. There's nothing to love. It's all to criticize and to. We have this corrosive critique culture, I would say. And as Rusty Reno, the editor of First Things, says, the human heart needs something to love, to affirm, not just critique. But anyway, the point being that when I found the church, it was as though... No, I'm sorry. My point was that the reason why this Christianity spread was not some colonial enterprise. It was because people were willing to risk their lives going into the depths of any jungle to tap fellow humans on the shoulder and say, hey, your life matters. There's a meaning to all of this. God, who is love, loves you because that is his nature. And he's coming after you to bring you back to him. He broke into this reality to heal us. So rejoice. This is the good news. This is the gospel. And so it makes total sense why this is the religion that went all over the world. So, and it found me in a podcast.
That's one. I mean, so many wonderful parts to that, but Bach and Jordan Peterson not being the least. The question I'm left with afterwards is, if I was writing a history of the world and the history of the church, your story would be every man. It would be, and because it's so obvious that as you described it, of course it happened like that. Of course, given your longings, given the God-shaped hole in your heart, of course, given who God is, given who Bach is, and given Dr. Peterson's canny way with myth and metaphysics and symbolism, of course, and therefore it really ought to be enough for us as Catholics just to occupy the public square, leave our buildings open and say, come and listen to Bach and come and bump into the Blessed Sacrament. But what surprises me is it doesn't happen to everybody like it happened to you. What am I missing? Why did all the doors just click open, albeit through the path of addiction and difficulty and postmodern smorgasbord? Nonetheless, it still all clicked open for you, and it doesn't click open for them.
Well, I think that there is history that suggests that it has in the past. So, for example, you had pagan Rome, which was Christianized, and it wasn't in the beginning. It started with 12 people, and then the entire empire, and then Christendom, right, which became Europe. So we're in a stage, but it comes and goes. It's like, history might not be a straight line progression. It sort of comes in cycles. And so I'm, in the short term, very sort of pessimistic, Gavin, because as you said, we have many ways of distracting ourselves, and we've gone down some very dark paths in our lives. The culture of death reigns today. But in the long term, I'm optimistic because when the suffering inevitably comes, like I put it on steroids because I was seeking so hard and really, I went to all the wrong places: power, pleasure, wealth, honor, all of them. I think that the culture will eventually go, and then when the suffering comes, we have the answer to that suffering. We have the cross. We have the, I was listening to some philosophers trying to, talk about the meaning culture. This English guy, Ian McGilchrist, and John Vervaeke, and these guys they're having this discussion about, hey, wait a minute. They can sense it. They're not Christians, but they can sense that we've lost our sense of the divine. We've gotten too rationalistic, and we've dumbed reason down to just sort of pure scientific reason, to sort of scientific rationality, and we need something else. But I listened to a 3-hour conversation with these gentlemen, and they didn't bring up Aristotle. They didn't bring up Aquinas. So it's hiding in plain sight. It just needs for us to go out into the public square, stop navel-gazing as a church, and go out to where the people are, and to proclaim the good news. And, so to me, it's the same as it ever was. It just means that the people aren't coming to the church. So what you're doing and what I'm doing with my podcast ministry is to take the church to the people, because they need this message. Gavin, one other thing when I was traveling, I have business still in Europe. I'll be back in a month or so to Europe, and I started to do these experiments. I had this ministry idea that the Holy Spirit gave me, from nomad to pilgrim. Like I think it was Rod Dreher, the writer, said, I entered Chartres Cathedral a tourist, and I left a pilgrim. So I have this idea of like all these nomadic souls, these young people traveling around the world. I wasn't so young. I was way too old to be doing that. But there's a lot of people, because now you can work on a laptop. And so I started to go to these co-working spaces and give talks. And I wasn't giving talks about Christianity, hey, why you should accept the Lord Jesus Christ as your Savior, because nobody would go to that talk. But yes. I was going to talks about philosophy. I would say, like, hey, how philosophy can change your life. And just going over the basics of classical metaphysics, the basics of, hey, why are we so skeptical about reason? So really trying to talk to people about the logos. Because if the logos if we deny logos, then we're of course going to deny that the logos took flesh. And today we're even denying logos. We're denying we can know anything. We can know anything about the human person, what's good for the human person, how a human person should live. What is it? What is the basis of truth, or are we morally relativistic or not? All of these deep questions. And my sense from giving these talks was that people are so hungry. It just needs to be presented in the right way. It's harder to go directly towards, hey, Jesus is your guy. That's hard.
You can't do that. That's right.
Yeah,
you get turned off easily. Right,
but you can go to, okay, so you're telling me there's no truth, Mr. Modern Relativist. Well, is that true? Is it true that there's no truth? Right? And you sort of start there. Like, okay, so at least I can get you to say that you're a Platonist, because you're speaking to me. You're referencing some realm of truth that is immaterial. It's not in your mind. It's not in my mind. It's independent of our minds, because you're referencing it as a way of convincing me. What is that realm? Oh, that realm of truth also relates to the world, because that's why you're making arguments to it. You're telling me that it has claims over my life. So that's like you're basically halfway to you're, as Nietzsche said, Christianity is just Platonism for the masses. So if I can get you to Platonism, maybe I can get you to the next stage, which is, hey, that world of forms, that logos became flesh and became a man. So why I'm excited is because I think people are hungry for it. We just need to figure out the methodology to bring it to them so that God's grace can grow in their hearts. We just need to find that crack, that way in.
I have a couple of questions, and I love what you're saying, and I agree with you. When I was a university professor, I set aside an hour a week in my faculty office to run a group called Skeptics Anonymous. And the deal was that anybody could come, just knock on the door. There were no rules, apart from the fact that I gave out red paper napkins, and if somebody started talking technically jargon from their academic discipline to intimidate other people, then all you had to do was raise the napkin, and then they had to do an explanation in words no longer than two syllables. So that cut out the bullshit quite quickly. But one of the things that happened was people began talking as you are, and quite quickly made their way towards Jesus and the truth. But they work very well in the university environment. It doesn't work quite so well outside. And one of the things, there are two things I think that are missing from your story that I'm surprised are missing. And usually there's somebody who incarnates the truth, and through whom the love and the forgiveness and the compassion become tactile in some kind of emotional way. And so far you've done all this all in your head, which I think, with a bit of help from Bach, which I think is incredible. And I'm surprised. I'm missing the tactile incarnation person. And the other thing I'm missing is desperate suffering, because normally somebody as clever and as independent as you has to get a bit more broken by tragedy, a little more intense than what you've described. And so I'm very impressed by the kind of graceful way you've swooped towards the truth on uplifts that have come just at the right moment. But almost I get, and of course you've condensed all this into a very short piece, but still I'm missing these two things, which I find in other people's stories more often.
Interesting. Well, yes, I did condense it, and I've skipped over, some areas that would describe maybe better the level of darkness that we're talking about. So, you mentioned a little bit with drugs and alcohol,
sure.
All kinds. So there was enough that I was doing that I had, like my path to God was not one that suffering was the whole thing. The mystery at the cross was the entire way. I had, broken down to the point where, I was just lost, completely lost. Mm-hmm. So I don't, it's hard to give that sense to people, but just
it's hell.
Lost
it's the beginning.
Yeah. So
of
I mean,
hell.
in every way. So it's not so. Maybe it doesn't sound it from what I'm saying, but in every way that you could imagine being lost. I had gotten involved with, there was sexual misdeeds, there were financial misdeeds, there was a sense of just meaninglessness, nihilism. I had gone the Nietzsche route, where it's just sort of, I was making up my own values, and it was just terrible.
Did the despair? Had you despaired?
100%. Yes, I ended up, with all kinds of. I ended up in with mental difficulties of anxiety, depression, sure. Different areas there that were just horrible. That was what got me into the meditation, was to try to alleviate the anxiety. I lived in New York for 9/11, and after that day, that was another day that was really profound in my life. Sort of changed my perception of the future, because in 9/10/2001 I was walking around in New York City. It was a beautiful sunny day, and then 9/11, the same day, I thought it would be sort of similar. I had this impression of how the day would go, and then obviously, as everybody knows, it went very different. And I got a call from my partner at that time, Sarah's father, and we didn't know where she was for 2 hours because she was in the subway. And then all of a sudden, the smoke came and the towers fell, and that all entered. It looked like you were in it was like the sky turned orange and it was snowing because of all the ash that was falling. Mm-hmm. It was like a bad psychedelic experience. So these people that are so into psychedelic experiences, that would be a bad one. And after that, the level of anxiety that I experienced, I had experienced maybe a little bit before, but that it sort of went through the roof, and it got so bad that I was having so many panic attacks that I essentially burnt out all of my adrenal system, so I could no longer move. I was essentially catatonic by the end of that experience after a couple of years, and I couldn't do anything except cry and maybe get myself out of bed to go to the bathroom. That was it. So that was where the journey towards the Eastern spirituality began. Was I was trying to exist in consciously without being in absolute dread 24 hours a day.
That's very clear and very helpful and extremely moving, and thank you. And what I hear you saying was the antidote is obviously Bach. We've begun to talk about that, but going into the church. I've always thought that because of the medieval vision, the churches are built in the sign of the cross, and in one sense, one enters architecturally into the body of Jesus when one goes through the door and one walks up, if you like, the legs into the torso by where and then the heart is in the transept, and there's something very physical about the way in which the medieval cruciform church architecturally embodies the body of Jesus. And then, as well as that, we have the Blessed Sacrament. So, I mean, you've presented a very good case intellectually for taking people from first principles towards the incarnation. It sounded like you just went into the body of Christ and allowed the Blessed Sacrament to irradiate you. Is that what happened, or is there more to it?
Well, I suppose that the experience of being in the church for me, I always found more in silence. So I love argumentation, I love discussion, but ultimately that long experience through the Eastern traditions got me very acquainted with silence, a lot of silence. And it's like in the Bible, be still and know that I am God. And I really feel like it was the stillness, that formless, eternal stillness, that was how mysteriously he knit me back together and knit me to him in a certain way. And the church was an instantiation, because I wasn't going to services. I was going when it was quiet. So it was just him and I in silent, that eternal moment, just luxuriating in the peace that I felt in that place. And that was I think that was really what it was. And then, it's interesting, when I finally started to go to the actual service, it was during COVID. I came back to Philadelphia and I got baptized and entered the church at the Cathedral Basilica here in Philadelphia. And it was so interesting because COVID was crazy. I mean, it was this really interesting contrast, because outside everybody was insane. Like here in Philadelphia, if you walked down the street without a mask on outside, people would like walk on the other side of the street and make the sign of the cross, or whatever. Or if you didn't want to inject some particular medical thing into your body, whatever. There was all, as you know, I don't have to go into the insanity. But contrast that, I would go into the church, and the procession would happen, and the people would be walking down in this slow Gregorian chant, and everything would slow. And I was in part of this multi-thousand-year procession of sanity, of the acceptance of death. As the prayer that you and I said before we started this, Gavin, was, Hail Mary, full of grace, the Lord is with thee. We talked about at the time of our death. So there is this acceptance of death. Whereas the outside world, the contrast of the insanity of the modern world with the sanity of the church. I didn't know that the churches were built in the body of Christ. I thought it was that they were built like arks, like they were boats, like a nave. And so I felt like I was on this ark of salvation, and the contrast that I was provided with in the inside the church and outside the church was so profound. And then in terms of relationships, I developed very deep relationships within. Once I began my sponsor Pete, he's the founder of my podcast ministry, First Fisherman Media. My name's Andrew. His name is Peter. So the First Fisherman. So First Fisherman Media. We created a different podcast to do the same thing that Bishop Barron did for me, to do for the rest of do our best to also contribute to being laborers in that field. Then I have a sister Claire, who has been a spiritual friend to me, who I speak with. We did she ran me through the Ignatian spiritual exercises in a small group, and her and I have continued to stay in touch, and she helps me. And so the Christian community that I've been able to build, but as I was going into Christianity, I didn't really have that. So you're right there. I didn't really have anybody. It was really virtual. So it was Bishop Barron and people like that, and then my experiences in the church.
Well, the interesting thing about the world we live in now is that if you get to have a relationship with Bishop Barron on screen, that's good enough. I mean, having Barron on screen may be better than having somebody less competent, tactilely
He's amazing.
available.
What a gifted evangelist! What a gifted evangelist! The Word on Fire. I think he's the most powerful Catholic evangelist that I had seen online. I think he's amazing. The Lord has blessed that man. I think his work is incredible in everything he's doing. He wants to start a whole new religious order, an order of evangelists, a new media first evangelist. So he's got all kinds of amazing things happening. The Lord is working in the Word on Fire. If anybody has not experienced it, please go and follow his work.
The other thing that strikes me is that you didn't have to be deprotestantized. In other words, for a lot of the people that I meet from my world, you only have to talk about the Mass, and they go, well, that's an idolatrous thing, or Mary, and they go, no, she's the eternal fertility symbol, or priests, no, they're some form of manipulative authority figure. There are no priests. So, I mean, I'm used to getting this whole kind of first-line barrage of Protestant disinformation. But you seem to have been wonderfully, remarkably, and happily free from.
Well, it's interesting. I had a friend of mine who converted to a Protestant version of Christianity right at the same time. And what I noticed he at the same exact time, we both converted, both in our middle age, late middle age. I was 48, he's like 50. And in the beginning, he was still going from church to church to church. I think he's found a church now. But to me, the big three questions of apologetics are, is God, what is the best explanation for what is? Is it random chance, as our atheist friends might have it? Or is it God? Is it some first mover of the Aristotelian / Aquinas sort? So that's question number one. I didn't have that hard a time with that one. The second question is Jesus. Did this creator become flesh and dwell amongst us, and did he rise from the dead? That was a hard question for me. And then the third was, okay, did he found a church, and if so, which one? And so the first one was not... No, sorry, go ahead.
So this is so interesting. I just don't want to, I don't want to rush by because there's a lot of material here. So the first one, I can see how, with a capacity for a clear line of thought, you would move at least from the self-contradictory nonsense of atheism. Asking cogent questions, but presuming a non-cogent environment to ask them in. I mean, it's so it's so stupid. I just for goodness sake. Your first premise is contradictory. Surely you can see that. You call yourself an intelligent person. But then moving from that to Jesus, there's obviously one of the things that happens is that there's perverse metaphysical disinformation that comes in. The moment you start talking about Jesus, the demons are very keen to muddle us and draw us away. A lot of people find it very difficult to believe that God is not power, but rather vulnerable. That God is willing to be compassion rather than justice. To move away from the kind of raw Nietzschean. Is that, how did you tell us a bit more about how you managed to accept Jesus as being the Logos, the Word incarnate, the vulnerable God who loves so much he comes to find us?
It's interesting because there is a very strong Jesus presence in the New Age, but he's more of the hippie, like you'll find a lot of these New Age teachers talk about Jesus, but he's a very, kind of lovey-dovey hippie kind of guy, just a spiritual master. Maybe he went to India and became enlightened, and this whole Christianity thing is really just him trying to get us all to be here now, and that's kind of it. So I was in that world for a while, so that was what Jesus was to me. I also had a lot of antibodies against Jesus being Jewish because we have a strong aversion in the Jewish faith to Christianity because of the history. And it's so central to the tenet of Judaism that Jesus was not the Messiah, because we're still waiting. So obviously there's a big problem there. But I think
so. Is this just because you're quite right? I'm for so many of my Jewish friends and even my Jewish family, I started on the assumption, but he's one of us.
Right. They don't get that.
But they don't get that. And I've always wondered, there must be something else that stops them. Obviously, if they're very well read historically, then there's a degree of resentment and persecution, of course. But this automatic but he's the epitome of Judaism. He's the Jew, but but something gets in the way of that one has to overcome.
Yeah, it didn't. Explaining to my Jewish mother that I'm still Jewish because I'm just a fulfilled Jew went absolutely nowhere. And she, she is still to this day thinks that I became Catholic to hurt her. But anyway,
I'm so sorry. Of course,
that's the Jewish mother. But anyway,
yes, that's right.
I found the problem that people have is that we live in a culture that wants the only absolute in our culture is non-judgmentalism, or this idea of like anything goes. You do you, I'll do me. Your truth, Gavin, is your truth.
Who am I to judge?
Right, exactly. Like the Charles Taylor, we all live in our little buffered selves, our little affective buffered selves, where I have my own little feelings, and that's all I have. You have your own little feelings, and your little buffered self. There's nothing in between us. There's no reality that we're talking about, essentially. So you have that, and so what Christianity breaks through that because it forces a claim on you of like either Jesus was what he says he was, and Christianity is true, or he's not. And so that's a historical claim. And I found the work of Lee Strobel, The Case for Christ, who's a gentleman who was an investigative journalist, like a crime journalist, whose wife became Christian. And in an attempt to convince her that she shouldn't be a Christian, he went to go study it. And then he became a Christian himself when he studied the evidence. So to me, it was pretty simple, Gavin. It's ultimately like, okay, given that there's so many people today, if you go down to Jerusalem today, there are people on the street corners, or down in Philadelphia here, in robes telling you that they're a prophet or they're God or they're the second coming or what have you. That's been true throughout all of history. So the question you have to answer for yourself is, so this one gentleman from, Nazareth comes into Jerusalem, and what best accounts for what happened after his life? Because it's 2024 because he existed. Some 33-year-old, carpenter. So what best accounts for that? What possible explanations do you have? He transformed the entire world. So okay, well, either... I have some friends who are like, oh, he wasn't real, so even the historical Jesus wasn't real, but that's not a serious argument. Most people would say something along the lines of, well, maybe everybody was tripping on mushrooms, the psychedelic aficionados today, which are so prevalent, they're thick as thieves. Yes, everybody was tripping. And I've been involved in psychedelic experiences and seen some weird things in my day, and I have to say, nothing would I die for. No vision that I saw during my my mushroom trip would I ever actually be crucified for myself. And yet everybody was willing to do so, and they were all doubting Jews before that. So what best accounts for that? To me, it's pretty simple. What best accounts for that is the resurrection. So that was, for me, it was pretty simple. And then, like you said, the Protestant thing wasn't from there. There's only one church that has... the succession from Peter to today.
Continuity.
It's so simple. Yeah. So the whole Protestant thing made no sense to me whatsoever. I listen to some, in my more desperate moments late at night, I would find some Protestant preacher online some nights, and before I converted to the Catholic faith, and found some comfort in Charles Stanley or what have you. But at the end of the day, the Protestant thing was a non-starter because I think it was Jung who said, the end game of Protestantism is everybody has their own denomination. Every single individual Protestant will eventually come up with their own denomination because ultimately it's just them and their interpretation of the Bible. And there's so many interpretations, as many as there are Protestants. So
again, the flaw that runs through it is as disastrously contradictory as the original atheist flaw. The whole movement begins on the presumption that everyone reading the Bible will come to the same conclusion.
Exactly.
If they read themselves, and then it hasn't clicked. That there've been 100,000 different conclusions, as many conclusions. It's extraordinary, but again, of course, this is not logical. There's a degree of metaphysical disinformation. How does this work with your friend who converted at the same time, who's still looking for a church?
I think he's found one, but for him, it was just he was found some Christian groups online, some evangelicals in the South who are very allergic to Catholicism. So they didn't. He never really examined Catholicism because he put up that's just weird Marian worshippers and saint worshippers, and they're not they're not really saved because they don't go directly to Christ. They go to all these intermediaries, including the church. So he just never was open to. He never really examined. It's like what is it Fulton Sheen said. It's like there's a lot of people who disagree with the Catholic Church, who think they disagree with the Catholic Church, but they just don't know what they're not really disagreeing. They just never really examined what the Church really believes. And I would say he fills in that category.
That's very helpful. And I'd like to ask you, so having become a Catholic around about COVID, so 2019-ish, is that where?
Yeah,
so we
2 years. It'll be 2 years. I was doing RCIA during that time, so I became a Catholic 2 years ago in April.
Right, and so how have you found the state of the civil war in the Catholic Church? So you've come in with this great sense of, oh my goodness, this is true. I'm astonished. It's amazing. How are you coping with the civil war? What's your interpretation of it?
Well, I think that. I'm with Bishop Barron on that, which is that I see that the church attempting to conform itself to the world is a disaster. Because
can I just stop you? I've got an electronic machine going off, and I'm just going to have to tell Thomas that at 45 minutes he's going to need to clip something out. I'm just going to take 10 seconds to
take your time.
It.
No problem.
Because otherwise it'll harass us for the rest of the conversation. Right.
I would say
here we are.
First of all, it's no surprise that the demonic goes after the church. That's the first thing. So that the demonic already has all the people sitting with needles in their arms on the street. They don't need to go down there. So the demons are going after the church. So that's super clear. I would say that to me. I think I'm with Pope Benedict, who said that probably the church will get smaller but more serious. So you see that in the young priests in the United States. They are very traditional. They are very serious about the magisterium and what the church believes. And it used to be that wasn't the case. There was a lot of liberal priests. There was a large, let's say there was, like, for example, it used to be that if you were a same-sex attracted man, the priesthood was a good place for you to go because you weren't that accepted in the culture. For example, I'm just giving an example. And you were kind of accepted within the church in a certain way. There was a certain subset of priests and seminaries where that was acceptable. A good place to hide out and to sort of live your life in a furtive way. And now it's the culture totally embraces same-sex attracted people and they're put on a pedestal, and so there's no need for them to come into the priesthood in this way. So now the priests that are coming and becoming priests have to accept that we live in the negative world of Christianity, meaning that it used to be, as Aaron Renn, the Protestant philosopher, talks about, we used to be that it was positive to be a Christian in the American culture. Then it was kind of neutral. Now it's actively negative. So just that statement I made, it's actively negative. So if you're going to be a priest, you are doing that because you are really called by the Lord to that vocation, and it's not. And so I think that there's going to be a purification process, and I think that's only natural. And I believe what Christ said, which is that the world cannot prevail against the church. So no matter what the difficulties, we're on the right team. Like, this is the right place to be. So
that's really such an interesting idea. That with so the church sanctifies society, and then, if you like, there's a kind of an equilibrium. But as society loses the sanctification, it celebrates disordered sex, and the church therefore no longer acts as a hiding place for disordered sexuality.
Right.
And so the deeper corruption of society acts as a purification agent for the church.
Exactly. That's what the benefit was talking about. Exactly.
I think that's very powerful.
I think that's very right, because I think, Gavin, that's the battle lines. It's the sexual revolution is really the battle lines.
Yeah.
It was where we basically went back to the Garden of Eden and said, yeah, we're going to do it our way. Maybe began with the feminist thing, which Alice von Hildebrand said, is essentially a war against procreation, essentially a war against maternity. Instead, we want to go out and have women wanted to go out and have sexual experiences like men did and saw that as a freedom. And then you had the homosexual movement, the same-sex attracted movement after that. And then now we have this new thing, which is, the transgender thing, which is if men and women, if you start out, I think Scott Yenner talked about this, where if you start out with men and women are interchangeable, we're just two little pods in this liberal bubble, and then all of a sudden the end game of that philosophically is that, well, why not biologically the same? Why can't we just, if we can switch the roles, why can't we just switch within ourselves if we feel a different way? It combines that kind of philosophy with the sort of modern neo-Gnosticism of the mind-body dualism. So I think
a form of escapist androgynousness. Yes,
exactly.
Yeah, that's very good. Yeah.
So that's the church is experiencing that battle because that's where it's coming in. We have Father James Martin here in the States who wants to, it's kind of like our little German bishop, where it's sort of, or priest, where he wants to rewrite the church's sexual teaching and say it's not progressive enough, it's not of the world enough, and we're turning people away, and Jesus accepted everybody kind of thing. Whereas my view is the more traditional Catholic view, which is that sex has a purpose thing. Because, look, Gavin, it goes. I think it goes back deeper to. There's a great group of philosophers at the John Paul II Institute at the Catholic University, and one of which is Michael Hanby, and he talks a lot about this idea of, really this began with Bacon, where we took the Aristotelian idea that things have a nature, that nature is imbued with meaning, and all of a sudden nature just became stuff, just manipulatable stuff by our will. And once you have that revolution, now all of a sudden all bets are off. There's no teleology left. There's no telos. So when I have a conversation with a secular friend, there's so much throat clearing that needs to happen. And he's like, so why do you think homosexuality is wrong? Or why do you think transgenderism is wrong? You have to go all the way back. Do things have a purpose? What does sex have a purpose? What is sex for? If you and I are going to discuss whether one sexual version or another sexual philosophy is right or wrong, or ordered or disordered, sex itself has an end. Can we even have that discussion? Because if it doesn't have an end other than whatever you want, then who cares? Then nothing. It's sort of, so there's so much deeper reconstituting of a philosophical framework that's necessary in the modern world that the same thing's happening in the church.
You're right. It's very difficult to get people out of the rut where everything is just for our pleasure.
Exactly.
And the assumption is, I'm a consumerist. I'll consume. It's me. Why are you even asking me these difficult teleological questions? I just want to enjoy and eat. So leave me alone. I'd like to move the conversation because we're close. We've been talking for a while. I'm enjoying every second, but I don't want to. I don't want to exhaust the patience of our listeners. Let's just move on to your being an entrepreneur in an increasingly anti-Christian culture. We're surrounded by economic, social, political forces who really don't like the look of us the moment we arrive, and invite them to reconsider their basic presumptions and presuppositions. And so they're freezing us out, the whole cancel culture. What's your approach to being frozen out by this hostility?
It's a great and important question. I have friends of mine that work in big institutions, and they have to bite their tongue all the time, and they go through these diversity commissar type questionnaires that they have to feign fealty to some kind of insane whatever this multicultural world is, and it's basically anti-Christian, essentially, is what it is. Yeah. It's an anti-Christian culture. It's a repudiation of the church and her beauty and her teaching. So what do you do? To me, I thought that being an entrepreneur was a good way to be uncancelable. So the business, I built a business, and in that business, if a client was listening to this and got upset at anything that I said, they could leave, and that wouldn't be like getting fired from a job. I have a bunch of other clients. Number one. Number two, most of the clients don't even know me because the first company I built, I no longer work there. So it provided a way for me to be abstracted a little bit. And then I started a new company called Good Shepherd Staffing, and we help Catholics in developing countries find work that enables them to make a living local wage as well as work from home, so they don't have to leave their families. And this time, because my first company was based in the Balkan region called Growth Era, I had my conversion, and I didn't feel comfortable praying in my own company because it wasn't like, I had Muslims and atheists and everybody, so I didn't want to pray rosaries there. I just felt it was inappropriate. So my new company, I wanted to be very publicly Christian because everything in my life is for God. Everything in my life is Christian. And so I reject this idea of private Christianity. It's like D.L. Schindler, another philosopher from Catholic U, says, that's like having a private language. It's unintelligible. This fake separation of church and the public square is insane and doesn't make any sense. I'm a Christian at home. I'm a Christian at work. I'm a Catholic everywhere, every part of my life. And so why would my business not be the same? And so I think that we should be going boldly into the public square as business people, as teachers, as whatever we are, as Catholics, with our crucifix, because that's what the world needs. The world does not need us to retreat. We were sold this false, the false promise of liberalism was a neutral public square. That was a lie. That was never neutral. They have a comprehensive metaphysic. They have a comprehensive anthropology of the person. And they have a comprehensive, guess what, anti-Christian philosophy. And so that's what exists. So we have to be, we're not supposed to, run to our corner. We're supposed to go out into the public square and say, no, what you need is you need the Lord. You need God in your life. You need to join his church. That's the salvation. That's the purpose of your life. And that's true in business as well as any other aspect.
So I love this, but let me put another voice because I'd like to hear your take on it. So I have no difficulty with this. I think it's great. Courageous and determined with a sense that God invites us to be brave. The Rod Dreher approach, which is the Benedict option, which has said, well, look, the problem with the public square is that we've completely... So, he's speaking to people who are some way behind the curve of the argument you've presented. But the people he's speaking to, he's saying, look, you forget the public square. It's stitched up. It's closed. It's dangerous. You can't retake it. So save the mistaken energy of retaking it and reculer pour avancer, get out of their reach so they can't cancel you and hurt you. Right. Start praying and developing communities of self-enablement, and then there'll come the point when there'll be a new configuration and you can move forward. Right. So is he talking about the same thing but over a longer period of time with a bit more, is this an introvert talking as opposed to an extrovert, or is how do we put these two views together?
I think it's a great point. I think Rob's point is often mistaken. I think that what he's talking about is just creating Christian community. I don't think that he means definitely pulling away from the public sphere, just making sure that you have community, you've built community, and you're realistic about the state of the public. I like the Boniface option, which St. Boniface was there and, attempting to convert the pagan Germanic tribes. I like a more aggressive approach. Or the Dominic option, one of our podcasts called the Dominic option, which is St. Dominic went and spoke to an Albigensian in a bar and then created the Dominican order when that Albigensian eventually, through God's grace, came back to the church. So I think we're supposed to go out and, yes, I agree. It's difficult. It's costly. It will cost you friends. It will, it's a cross. But I think if you look at, there's people, I think the really interesting group in the United States, if anybody's never seen them, is called New Polity out at Franciscan University. Andrew Willard Jones and these guys, they've created in Steubenville, Ohio, a kind of a Benedict option community where a bunch of very serious Catholic couples and families have gone there, and they've created a vibrant Catholic culture. And so from their perspective, he's a scholar of the Middle Ages, and he says that this change is not going to happen from the top down. It's going to happen from the bottom up. So Rod is right in that way. What you're going to do is you're going to create friends around you in England, and you're going to have a sane culture in the best way that you can, and fight off the modern dominant culture, and you create your own little dominions, your own little groups. And that way, then, when enough people do that, then the next beachhead comes up, and that's how initially the Romans were converted. because they saw these groups of Christians living joyful lives, living charitable lives, living honest lives, and they were attracted to that. And that's how they grew naturally. So I think that that's the way. I think so. In a way, I agree with Rod. It's going to be a bottom-up phenomenon, but I don't think that the idea that we can hide or duck our heads under the rug, I think that's a fantasy.
So, some of the other things we're going to discuss are an extension of this, and essentially, but it sounds as though you're almost saying, if you've got any entrepreneurial skills, become an entrepreneur, because this is easier, quicker, more effective if you do this from a position of independence rather than if you're trying to work within systems that have been wholly taken over by an anti-Christian spirit and polity. So basically, step outside and start again.
I'm not sure that that's true, because being an entrepreneur is very difficult, and so I'm not sure it's for everybody.
So that's why I wanted you to address the question. Yes.
Yeah, I think it's very difficult, and if you're called to it, then you should do it. But you should discern and be prudent, because it's not for everybody. It's a very difficult thing to do, and it requires a certain personality type, perhaps, to do that. But if you're called to it, I definitely think it's a great solution. The other thing you can do is work for businesses that are aligned with what you believe in. I don't like the word values, because that means that it's sort of we're choosing them. It's the sort of a Nietzschean word. I like principles maybe as better. So to me, you don't have to have your own business, but you'll go try to find places where you can work, where you can be a Catholic, where you don't have to hide your Catholicism. You go find other people, go find other entrepreneurs who are Catholic, and go work for them. That might be, even if you don't want to start your own business. I'm not trying to discourage people from starting.
No. This is exactly the balance I hope you'd bring to it. This is very good.
Be prudent about it.
Very good. Last question before we finish: the importance of maintaining a life of prayer, despite how the busyness of one's commitments. Tell us a bit about that in your experience.
Yeah, I think I believe in the Lord's Prayer. It says, "Give us this day our daily bread." It doesn't say give us our weekly bread or our monthly bread or our yearly bread. It says daily bread. So I go to Mass every day to receive that bread, to receive our Lord. And then I also committed to what Fulton Sheen stresses the importance. I've had a strong monastic call. Yeah, the holy hour. So I do a holy hour after that in silence, where I pray a rosary. And so to me, prayer is, or I subscribe to Saint Benedict, the rule of Saint Benedict, ora et labora. So I think prayer is essential. I think, what is it? Was it one of the English, maybe Yeats? So prayer is naked intent towards the divine. So I really love this idea of communing with our Lord, especially in adoration, in silence, because I believe that, again, that's where we come to know Him. At least for me, I feel the closest to our Lord when I'm in church and it's silent and I'm sitting before Him in the Blessed Sacrament. And there's no images in my mind. It's just peace and breath and His presence, and I feel that eternal moment, and that feeds me. That fills my soul in such a way that gives me the strength to move on and the strength to live my life. Because that sort of yokes me to Him in a certain way, and so I need that every day. I can't live without that, because otherwise I'll just get involved in the speed of the modern world and business and all the surface area of my life. As Bishop Barron talks a lot about in Chartres Cathedral, they have the rose window where in the center is Christ and the wheel of fortune around it. And if I don't have that relationship with Christ, this is the center of my life, then I'll be only on the wheel of fortune. I will only be caring about what, if my business is going well or my relationships or what have you. And those, as you know, we're all temporal. Things go up and down. Everything passes away. It's a world of death. And what we need to encounter in this life is life, a world of eternal existence, a world of heaven on earth. As St. Catherine of Siena says, all the way to heaven is heaven. So we need to experience that here, and the way we do that, I believe, is in silence, in prayer before our Lord. And so I can't stress I can't stress the importance of it enough. Without that, I think you have nothing.
Andrew, it's been a wonderful conversation from beginning to end. I'm so grateful. Thank you for taking the time and making yourself available and sharing the conversation. I'm sure that a lot of other people are going to find this very meaningful and very helpful. It's been very generous of you.
It was wonderful, and I've loved it. And if anybody is questioning their faith, as they said, the Catholics are right about everything. Just go commit to the church. You're in the right place. You found the cover box to the puzzle of life, and you're in the right place. Don't listen to the demonic forces of destruction. The Lord is here.
And alongside the Bible, have a catechism.
Amen. Amen.
It's been such a joy. Thank you.
Thank you so much.
So I'll leave